The night sky over the countryside was split open by lightning, the kind that rattled old windows and sent flocks of birds into flight. Elijah trudged through the mud-soaked field, his boots sinking into the wet soil with every step. The storm had come without warning, and the rain fell so heavily it felt like the heavens themselves were collapsing. His crops, his only livelihood, lay flattened in places, washed down by the floodwater. Each step he took was heavy with worry. The small farm had been his home for years, inherited from his father, and though it barely kept him alive, it was all he had left. As he turned to head back to his barn, a sound cut through the thunder, a metallic crash, sharp and unnatural, echoing through the trees beyond his fields. It wasn't the wind or falling branches. It was something else, something that didn't belong out here. Elijah froze for a moment, squinting through the sheets of rain. The noise had come from the far side of the property, near the dense patch of woods that bordered his land. He hesitated. Any sensible man would have waited for the storm to pass, but something in his gut urged him forward. Holding his lantern high, he began to run, the wind whipping against his face. The mud splashed up his legs as he pushed through the rows of corn, his heart pounding faster with each step. Then, through the flashes of lightning, he saw it twisted metal, flames flickering weakly against the storm. A small plane had crashed right in the middle of his field. The sight made his stomach drop. He dropped the lantern and sprinted toward the wreckage. The smell of smoke and fuel burned in the air. The rain hissed as it hit the hot engine, sending up bursts of steam. "Hello," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. No response came, only the crackle of fire and the groan of twisted metal. His heart raced. He peered inside through a shattered window and saw her, a woman slumped in the pilot's seat. Her face pale, one arm hanging loosely at her side, blood trickling down her sleeve. Without thinking twice, Elijah pulled open the damaged door, gritting his teeth as he forced the bent frame apart. The woman stirred slightly, but didn't wake. The seatbelt was jammed, and his calloused hands fumbled with the clasp until it snapped loose. He reached in, lifting her gently into his arms. She was light, but his soaked clothes made every movement harder. The rain poured harder now, blurring his vision as he stumbled through the mud, her head resting against his shoulder. His jacket was barely enough to protect her from the cold, but he pulled it tighter around her anyway. The storm showed no mercy. Thunder rolled so close it shook the ground, and each flash of lightning illuminated the path only for a second before plunging him back into darkness. His farmhouse was a quarter-mile away, but it felt like an eternity. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, the wind cutting through him like knives. Still, he pressed on, one slow step after another, guided only by instinct and the faint glow of his home's lantern through the rain. By the time he reached the front porch, his breath came in ragged gasps. He kicked the door open, careful not to drop her. The warmth of the small house met the chill of the storm as he laid her down on the old couch near the fire. Her skin was cold to the touch, her pulse faint but steady. Elijah quickly threw another log into the fireplace, the flames crackling to life, casting dancing shadows across the walls. He grabbed an old towel, dried her face, and covered her with a wool blanket. For a moment, he just stood there, catching his breath, water dripping from his hat and sleeves. His eyes went to the window, where the storm still raged on, lightning streaking across the black sky. He turned back to the stranger, a woman, maybe in her 30s, her face delicate but strong, as if carved from resilience itself. Her clothes were torn, her hands bruised, but there was something about her, a quiet dignity even in unconsciousness. Elijah sat beside her, staring at the faint rise and fall of her chest. Who was she? What was she doing flying over farmland in a storm like this? The questions buzzed in his mind, but he knew they'd have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was keeping her alive. He checked her wounds, wrapped her arm in a strip of clean cloth, and whispered softly, "You're safe now." The storm continued to roar outside, but inside that small farmhouse, something shifted, a fragile thread of fate, tying two strangers together in the middle of the chaos. Elijah didn't know it yet, but that night's storm hadn't come to destroy his life. It had brought someone who was about to change it forever. The wind howled against the fragile walls of Elijah's farmhouse, making the windows rattle and the door creak on its hinges. Inside, the dim light of a kerosene lamp flickered over the room, throwing long shadows that danced across the wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of smoke and rain. Elijah knelt beside the couch where the woman lay, her face pale and motionless except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. Her soaked clothes clung to her skin, and small cuts marked her arms and neck. He had already cleaned her wounds the best he could, using pieces torn from an old bedsheet and the last of his antiseptic. Now, as he dipped a rag in warm water and placed it gently on her forehead, he caught the faintest whisper escape her lips, "Claire." The sound was fragile, like the breath of the storm outside, and it made him pause. So that was her name, he thought. Claire. He murmured it softly to himself, hoping saying it out loud might somehow keep her anchored to this world. The storm outside refused to calm. Rain pounded the tin roof like 1,000 angry drums, and each flash of lightning lit the small room in blinding white before plunging it back into shadow. Elijah kept glancing at the fire in the small brick hearth, feeding it whenever it started to fade. He didn't have much firewood left, just enough for the night, but he used it all anyway. The woman needed warmth more than he needed comfort. He checked her pulse again. It was weak, but steady. Relief washed over him, followed by exhaustion. He hadn't eaten since morning, but the thought of food barely crossed his mind. Still, when her breathing grew shallow, he realized she needed strength. He stood slowly, his old bones stiff from the cold, and went to the kitchen corner. The shelves were nearly bare. A half loaf of bread, a jar of honey, and a pot of thin vegetable soup from earlier that day. He heated it over the fire, stirring quietly as the wind moaned through the cracks of the window. The smell of broth filled the room, simple but comforting. He tore off a small piece of bread, softened it in the soup, and carefully brought it to her lips. At first, she didn't respond, but after a moment, she swallowed, weakly but willingly. That tiny movement gave Elijah hope. "Easy now," he whispered. "You'll be all right." Hours passed slowly, marked only by the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall and the occasional groan of thunder. Elijah stayed beside her, replacing the wet towel on her head every so often. Her face had more color now, though her brow still glistened with fever. He could see she wasn't just exhausted. She'd been through something terrible. A crash like that didn't happen by chance, but it wasn't his place to ask questions. Not tonight. He knew pain when he saw it, and she didn't need words. She needed silence, warmth, and care. So he gave her that. Every few minutes, he'd check the fire, adjust her blanket, or whisper something to the empty room, just to fill the silence. He found himself studying her face under the soft glow of the lamp. She looked like someone from another world. Her clothes, even torn and dirty, were made of expensive fabric. A gold bracelet peeked from under her sleeve, scratched but still shining faintly. Whoever she wasn't used to a place like this, to the cracked walls, the worn-out furniture, and the sound of a leaking roof. Yet, here she was, depending on a man who had nothing left but decency. Elijah leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. The storm outside began to weaken, the thunder fading into distant rumbles. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house kept him alert. He couldn't let anything happen to her, not after what she'd survived. Sometime near dawn, the fire had burned low, and the gray light of morning crept through the windows. Elijah's head drooped, his body slumped in the chair beside her. But even in half-sleep, his hand stayed resting near hers, ready to move if she stirred. The storm had finally passed, leaving only the soft patter of rain against the roof. The fields outside would be ruined, he knew that much, but he didn't care. For the first time in a long while, something in his house felt alive again. The sound of her breathing, faint but steady, filled the quiet air. He didn't know her story, or where she came from, but that didn't matter. All he knew was that a stranger had fallen from the sky into his field, and somehow, in saving her, he'd found a reason to keep going. As the first rays of sunlight cut through the thinning clouds, Elijah whispered a small prayer of thanks, not for good harvest or fortune, but for life, for mercy, and for the simple hope that the woman named Claire would open her eyes again. The morning sun crept gently through the cracks of the farmhouse window, bringing a soft golden light that fell across the room where Claire lay. The storm had left behind a quiet calm, the kind that follows chaos, when everything feels suspended between relief and disbelief. Outside, the fields glistened under a thin mist, patches of mud reflecting the light like broken mirrors. Inside, the faint smell of smoke and rain lingered in the air. Claire blinked slowly, her vision clearing. The first thing she saw was the flickering glow of the dying fire and the worn wooden beams of the ceiling above her. Then her eyes moved to the figure slumped in a chair beside her, Elijah. His head rested against his chest, his hands rough and scarred, folded loosely in his lap. He had clearly stayed awake most of the night. For a long moment, she simply watched him, trying to piece together what had happened. Her arm ached, her clothes were torn, and there was dried blood near her wrist. Bits of memory came back, the storm, the spinning plane, the sound of the crash, and then, nothing but darkness. Her voice was weak when she finally spoke. "You saved me." Elijah stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He looked startled for a moment, as if he hadn't expected her to wake so soon. "Morning, ma'am," he said, standing awkwardly and rubbing the back of his neck. "You had a bad fall. Lucky I found you when I did." His voice was low and kind, though there was a certain shyness in it, the kind that comes from years of talking more to the wind than to people. Claire tried to sit up, but the motion made her wince. Elijah stepped forward immediately, steadying her with one hand. "Easy now," he said. "You're safe here. Storm's gone." She nodded, her eyes taking in the small room, cracked walls, a patched-up roof, and a single lamp on the table beside her. There were no signs of luxury or comfort, only the bare necessities. The faint hum of silence made her realize there was no electricity. The air felt still, touched only by the sound of birds outside and the faint creak of the wooden floor. She turned back to him, studying his face, the lines carved deep from years of sun and struggle, and the quiet humility in his eyes. "You've done so much," she said softly, "and you don't even know me." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Just did what anyone would have done." But Claire knew that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't have walked into a storm to save a stranger. Most wouldn't have shared their food or stayed up all night watching over someone they didn't know. As Elijah stepped outside to tend to the damage the storm had done, Claire's gaze wandered around the room again. Everything in the farmhouse spoke of years of hardship, the chipped plates stacked neatly on a shelf, the old boots by the door, the patched curtains fluttering in the soft breeze. And yet, despite the simplicity, there was warmth, a sense of care that couldn't be bought. Her eyes then landed on a small table near the wall. Upon it sat a faded photograph in a cracked wooden frame. She reached for it carefully, turning it toward the light. The photo showed Elijah standing beside a young woman with kind eyes and a little girl with ribbons in her hair. They were smiling the kind of smile that belonged to a time before loss. Beneath the glass, faint water stains had blurred the corners, but their faces were still clear. Claire's heart tightened. She could see love and pride in his expression, the same gentleness she had seen when he spoke to her. When Elijah returned, his sleeves rolled up and his boots covered in mud, he noticed her holding the photo. He paused, the easy calm on his face replaced by a quiet sadness. "Your family?" she asked, gently. He nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. My wife and little girl, he said after a moment. Gone 5 years now. Car accident. His voice didn't tremble, but the weight of the words filled the room. Claire set the photo down carefully, unsure what to say. I'm sorry, she whispered. Elijah gave a small nod. The kind people give when they've heard the same words too many times to respond. For a while, neither spoke. The sound of wind brushing through the broken fence outside filled the silence. Finally, Elijah said, Used to think I'd fix everything one day. The house, the fields, myself. He smiled faintly, though his eyes looked far away. But some things ain't meant to be fixed, I reckon. You just learn to live around the cracks. His words lingered in the air. Long after he left the room again, Claire sat quietly, her hand resting over the blanket, staring at the photo once more. She had met countless people in her life, powerful, wealthy, influential, but none had spoken with such raw honesty. She had been surrounded by luxury her whole life, yet here, in this humble farmhouse, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: sincerity. The man who had nothing had given her everything he could. Outside, Elijah's figure moved through the fields, his shoulders squared, his steps steady, despite the ruined crops. Watching him, Claire felt something stir in her chest, not just gratitude, but a deep admiration for the kind of strength that doesn't shout, the kind that simply endures. She didn't yet know how much this man's quiet compassion would change her, but for the first time since the crash, she smiled, not because she was safe, but because she was finally beginning to see what true wealth looked like. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, spilling golden light across Elijah's muddy fields. The storm was gone, replaced by a calm so deep that even the air seemed to be holding its breath. Claire sat on the porch, wrapped in one of Elijah's old blankets, sipping warm tea from a chipped mug. Her arm was bandaged neatly, and though her body still ached, her mind was clearer now. She looked out across the land, rows of flattened corn, broken fences, and puddles that shimmered like tiny mirrors, and wondered how one man could live with so little and still give so much. Inside the house, Elijah moved quietly, fixing the broken latch on the door, pretending not to notice her watching him. He wasn't one for long conversations, but there was a peace about him, the kind that came from a life of quiet endurance. Suddenly, the soft hum of distant engines broke the silence. At first, Elijah thought it was thunder rolling far away, but then the sound grew louder, sharper. He stepped out onto the porch, squinting toward the horizon. Their dots in the sky, glinting in the sunlight, moving fast. Helicopters. 3 of them. Claire set down her mug, her face tightening with recognition. Within minutes, the choppers descended over the field, the wind from their blades bending what remained of the crops. Dust and straw whirled through the air as uniformed men jumped out, waving and shouting over the roar. Miss Donovan, Miss Claire Donovan, one of them yelled, running toward the farmhouse. Elijah turned to Claire, confused. She stood slowly, her expression a mix of relief and hesitation. The lead rescuer reached her first, taking her hand. "Thank God we found you," he said breathlessly. "The storm knocked out your flight signal. We've been searching for hours." Elijah blinked, processing the name, Miss Claire Donovan. It sounded familiar, like a name he'd heard once on the radio or seen printed on something important. The man's next words confirmed it. "Your company's been in a panic," he continued. "Everyone feared the worst." Elijah's eyes widened slightly, the truth dawning on him. The woman standing barefoot on his porch wasn't just a lost pilot or some traveler blown off course. She was someone powerful, someone who lived in a world so far removed from his that it hardly seemed real. The men around her treated her with the kind of deference he had only seen given to officials or people of great influence. Claire, meanwhile, looked down at her muddy clothes and smiled faintly, almost embarrassed by the fuss. She glanced at Elijah, her eyes softening. "You didn't know, did you?" she said quietly. half to herself. He shook his head, still processing what he was seeing. "I don't much keep up with people like you," he said simply. "I just saw someone who needed help." One of the rescue team members handed her a clean jacket, and as she slipped it on, the change in her posture was subtle but undeniable. The frail, injured woman from the night before seemed to vanish, replaced by someone composed, elegant, and commanding. Yet beneath that confidence, there was still warmth, a quiet gratitude that words couldn't fully carry. The men urged her toward the helicopter, eager to get her to safety, but Claire hesitated. Her gaze lingered on Elijah, standing there with his sleeves rolled up, his boots still caked in mud, his eyes full of simple honesty. She stepped away from the group, walking back to him. The wind whipped through her hair, but her voice, when she spoke, was soft and steady. "You saved me when you had nothing," she said. "That's something money can't buy." Elijah shifted uneasily, scratching at the back of his neck. "Didn't think about it much," he replied. "Just did what I'd hoped someone would do for me." Claire smiled, her eyes glistening in the sunlight. The sound of the helicopters waiting behind her filled the air. But for a brief moment, the noise faded away, leaving only the two of them, bound by something that transcended wealth or circumstance. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, engraved pendant, pressing it into his rough, calloused hand. "Keep this," she said softly. "It's not much, but I want you to remember that kindness still matters, even in my world." Elijah looked down at the pendant. It was shaped like a small wing, probably from a necklace she wore, and nodded silently. "You take care of yourself now," he said. She smiled once more, then turned toward the helicopter. As she climbed aboard, she looked back one last time. Their eyes met through the swirling dust, and for a moment, it was as if the world had stopped moving. Then, the engines roared to life, and the machine lifted off, carrying her higher and higher until she was just a fading shape against the golden sky. Elijah stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, the pendant glinting faintly in his palm. The wind tugged at his clothes, and though his field lay broken before him, his heart felt strangely full. He didn't know what would come next, or if he'd ever see her again, but something inside him had shifted. Somewhere between the storm and the rescue, a spark of hope had returned, the kind he hadn't felt in years. Far above, the helicopters disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind only silence, sunlight, and a farmer who had learned that sometimes the richest moments in life come when you give without expecting anything in return. A week had passed since the helicopters vanished into the bright horizon, but Elijah still thought about that strange, unforgettable day. The pendant Claire had given him now hung from a nail above the fireplace, catching the morning light. It was the only piece of silver in the whole house, and every time the sun touched it, it glowed like a tiny reminder that something extraordinary had happened. Life, however, went on as it always did. The storm had left his fields in ruin, his fences broken, and his tools rusting faster than his savings could keep up. Yet, somehow, he didn't feel as hopeless as before. Every morning when he stepped outside, he felt a quiet strength inside him, as though the memory of helping someone had planted a seed of faith that nothing could wash away. The days were long, but he worked through them with a strange sense of calm. That calm shattered one afternoon, when he heard the distant rumble of engines again, but this time, it wasn't helicopters. It was something heavier, closer to the ground. Elijah wiped his hands on his overalls and stepped onto the porch, squinting toward the dirt road. A convoy of trucks approached slowly, their tires kicking up dust that glimmered in the sunlight. For a moment, he thought they must have taken a wrong turn. No one ever came down his road. Then he saw her. Claire, dressed simply in jeans and a white shirt, her hair tied back, sitting in the passenger seat of the first truck, waving with a smile that carried more warmth than the sun itself. Elijah blinked, almost certain he was imagining things. When the truck stopped in front of his house, she jumped down, her boots sinking into the mud, and walked up to him with the same quiet confidence he'd seen when she left. "You didn't think I'd forget, did you?" she said, laughing softly. Elijah shook his head, still in disbelief. I didn't expect this," he said, his voice rough. Behind her, men in work clothes began unloading lumber, paint, and tools. Another truck carried sacks of seed, new equipment, and crates of supplies. "What is all this?" he asked, staring in amazement. Claire smiled and crossed her arms, her eyes soft but firm. "It's not charity," she said. "It's gratitude. You gave me something I can never repay. You reminded me what kindness looks like." Elijah tried to speak but couldn't find the words. For a man who had lived most of his life in quiet solitude, this moment felt overwhelming. Claire patted his shoulder gently. "Come on," she said. "We've got work to do." For the next several days, Elijah's land was alive with the sound of hammers, saws, and laughter. The farmhouse that had once stood like a tired skeleton began to transform. The broken roof was replaced with strong new beams, the faded walls painted fresh white, and the floors sanded smooth. Claire worked alongside the builders, sleeves rolled up, dust streaking her face, but a smile never leaving her lips. Elijah watched in quiet amazement as this woman, a millionaire who could have sent others to do her bidding, knelt in the dirt beside him, helping plant seeds for his new crops. When he asked why she was doing it herself, she simply said, "Because this is what makes me feel human again." When the work was done, the old farmhouse looked reborn. The fences stood tall and straight, the fields glowed green with new life, and a small wooden sign now marked the entrance, "Carter's Field, Growing Hope." It had been Claire's idea. She told him that his kindness had inspired her to start something bigger, a community project that would help small farmers across the region recover from natural disasters. The local market, which had shut down years ago due to poor harvests, reopened with her help, and Elijah was the first to sell his produce there. People from nearby towns began to visit, curious about the story of the humble farmer and the woman he'd saved. But the greatest gift wasn't the money, the tools, or the repairs. It was the bond they shared. Every month, Claire returned, sometimes with her team, sometimes alone, always with that same warm smile. They would walk through the fields together, talking about the weather, life, and the things money could never buy. She'd help him plant or harvest, laughing at her own clumsy attempts to handle a hoe. And he'd tease her gently, saying, "You're learning, Miss Donovan. Maybe one day you'll make a farmer yet." To which she'd reply, "And maybe one day you'll teach me what real wealth feels like, but I think you already have." The seasons turned, and the once barren land began to bloom again, stronger and fuller than ever. The pendant above the fireplace stayed where it was, shining brighter now that hope had returned to the house. And every time Elijah looked at it, he remembered that everything had begun with one storm, one act of courage, and one stranger who had fallen from the sky. In saving her life, he had unknowingly saved his own. From that day on, his fields didn't just grow crops. They grew something far more precious: friendship, gratitude, and the living proof that a single act of kindness could change lives forever.